So I'll just give you a very brief introduction and background to Dr. Eduardo Fernandez. Currently, you're in Australia, so thank you for giving up your evening time to speak with us today. Really appreciate that. Eduardo is a senior lecturer of applied animal behaviour and welfare and director of the animal behaviour programme in the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Received his PhD in psychology from Indiana University, and most of Eduardo's past and current work involves behavioural research applied to the welfare and training of zoo, aquarium and companion animals. And as we know, Eduardo has published a number of papers in this area. Past positions include visiting professorship at Seattle Pacific University, a visiting professorship in the School of Behavior Analysis at the Florida Institute of Technology, and a research fellowship with Woodland Park Zoo. And that's just naming a very few there. But without further ado, I am going to hand over to you, Eduardo. Thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks. It'll take just a second. Let's make sure I can share this to start. And it looks like it's going to let me share that. So I do need to, let's set this up, and this is where it likes to always, there we go. I have to do the quick swap there. Okay, everything else should be fine. You should hear me okay? Yes?
Yep, can hear you. That's great.
Yep, great. All right. Well then, I'll go ahead and get into the presentation. And the first part that I was going to mention is just some of what led to the development of this presentation and the following paper. The first time I gave this presentation was just a little over a year ago. It was June of 2023 for the Shelter Playgroup Alliance. And I'd been building up to this kind of this model, this approach for a couple years because of some of the difficulties and really uh, theoretical and philosophical issues that I was seeing in what we were using to describe ethical animal training procedures or modern animal training procedures, positive reinforcement-based procedures, whatever you want to call this. That's part of the problem in and of itself, is that it's not clear what exactly people necessarily describe their approach as. So I wanted something that was a bit more cohesive. And as you'll see as I get into the presentation, there were some issues with some of the current models or some of the popular models that people were using. And then that, because of the presentation, that's part of what led to me. Initially, I wrote this paper as something that was going to go really be on a website, go to a training magazine. But there was a lot of interest in it, and that included from the Journal of Veterinary Behavior, which is a great journal, academic journal. And so I said, yeah, let me go ahead and publish this as a peer-reviewed publication, which just happened at the beginning of this year in January. And the nice thing is that this is the first model, the first animal training model to be published in an academic journal. So this is what I hope will not be the last approach to doing this as well, which is using peer-reviewed publications, that taking advantage of this, of academic journals, to have these discussions about how we proceed with being ethical in our animal training practices. So that said, I'll talk a little bit about the general outline. The presentation itself really covers three parts. The first of that being some of the history of ethics and training. I won't spend too long talking about that. I'll talk about what has been one of, at least for the past decade and a half, has been one of the common models or approaches used to describe uh, generally ethical or ethically inclined animal training procedures. But I'll talk about some of my concerns with that Lima model as we get into that second part. And then the third part will describe my life model or approach or framework. So I always like to put things into three parts or trilogies, well, especially for presentations and papers and whatnot. So trilogies are just a fun way to describe things. So I do that often with my presentations. And really, the main purpose of this talk is to establish a new framework for a force-free training philosophy. So that's really more than anything what I want to spend a bit of time talking about is just how can we be, and especially right now with what's been, it seems like there's a lot more turmoil recently in the particularly the dog training world. There's been a lot of things coming up. So I think more so than ever, it's a good time to talk about what describes us, what leads our ethics when we talk about what we consider ethical animal training practices. Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about this history of ethics, which you can't really have a discussion about animal ethics without first starting with people ethics. And I think the thing that surprises, it still surprises me, and I think it surprises many people, is and by the way, what I'm going to be using as my basis to talk about some of this history of applied ethics is a great paper, Mandel et al. 2011, who does a great job of covering some of the basics of what led to people ethics, us being able to involve people in things like research or medical practices. uh, I think the thing that is surprising, to continue the statement that I was making, still surprises me regularly, is how recent all of this is, even when it comes to people ethics. It was less than a century ago, and you might recognize something historically that was around that date when we talk about the Nuremberg Code. So, just really less than a century ago, when not even 80 years ago, uh, when we came up with a code to dictate how people could be used even in medical practices. Because up till then, so whether we're talking about research or application, there was no set of guiding principles, certainly no standard other than loosely described ones to say what you could or could not do with a potential human subject, with a potential human participant. So one of the first things the Nuremberg Code set up was the idea that people had to give voluntary consent to be a human subject. Again, less than a century ago. And somebody said, maybe we should have to have somebody's decision to be involved. So this is why when if you see 19th century fictional depictions of like the doctor running around and grabbing whoever he could and bringing them in to his experiments to make his Frankenstein monster or whatever it was, that's not that far off from what apparently could happen. So, Nuremberg Code was the first to really set up voluntary consent of human subjects. And then the benefits itself, so the beneficence involved. So the benefits of research must outweigh the costs. And that's benefits to the people involved, because we could say, sure, that, I'm getting lots of benefits out of doing this, but who is benefiting? Does it benefit the group, the people that are involved in that research? That's what we talk about when we think of beneficence. And not that far after that, we have the Declaration of Helsinki. So we're talking about 1964 here now. And really, for the most part, it's just refining the Nuremberg Code. And again, just as a frame of reference, the Nuremberg Code, if you didn't recognize by the name or the year, there was something that happened after World War II and was a response really towards some of the things that were happening based on Nazi science and Nazi medicine that happened, the atrocities that happened there, among the many atrocities that happened during World War II. That's part of what the Nuremberg Code was a response to. So the Declaration of Helsinki was mostly a refinement of the Nuremberg Code itself, although one additional thing, which was important too, helped establish a need for independent ethics review committees. So in the US, this is what you would think of as the Internal Review Board, or IRB, at a university. If we were talking about animals and the US, you would be thinking of IU-Cook, for ethics, for involved in research, and all the things that I do through my university require that I have at least animal ethics. If not, if there's also some human participation, then I also have some human ethics involved. We don't call it IRB and IU-Cook out here in Australia, but it's essentially the same thing. So that's part of these independent ethics review committees that are overseeing what you can do. So that's all we need to talk about with respect to human ethics, because as I'm already alluding to, it's setting the stage for some of what we start to do to form animal ethics. So that's where really we have a bigger interest here. And again, I'm going to give you a very brief history here on animal ethics, since a lot of it really stems from what happened to animals in the lab and then what was happening with animals on farms. And of particular note, there's a couple general frameworks. The first I won't spend too much talking about, which are the 3 Rs. It's mostly relevant for laboratory animals, so I don't have to spend too much time talking about that. But it did match human research ethics. The second, which is, I think, far more relevant for us, and starting with farm animals, is the 5 freedoms, really coming from starting to gain their formation in 1965, but being officially formulated in 79, created by the UK's Farm Animal Welfare Council, which has an unfortunate acronym there that you don't want to say too many times fast, the Farm Animal Welfare Council there. So focused on freedoms from, or reducing negative experiences. So what does that mean? Well, think about that for a second. We're talking about starting with 1960s. You have Bramble Report, you have the Farm Animal Welfare Council starting to say, what's determining, and again, now we're talking about barely over half a century ago, where they're saying, what's determining how we get to treat animals that we are that we have on a farm, where keeping them in captivity to be slaughtered for our consumption of something or another, our consumption. How do we determine whether they're treated ethically or not? And for the most part, what the Farm Animal Welfare Council decided is, well, we're going to at least give basic freedoms. And therefore, we're talking about freedoms from these events, reducing these particular negative experiences. So we need to make sure that if there's a bunch of cows here, or a bunch of chickens or pigs, that they are not starving, that they are not in some form of pain. Again, freedoms from these particular events. And now, not even a decade ago, David Mallour started to talk about the 5 domains going into the 1990s, so just a few decades ago, but he didn't really formulate the full concept of the 5 domains until 2016. And here now we're talking about, instead of focusing on freedoms from, we're talking about freedoms to events, or what he described as a life worth living. So this is just in the last decade, and we're seeing this big movement away from just using minimum standards, even for animal care. And I should say, just a few years ago, David Mallour included human-animal interactions into what in the Mallour et al. 2020 paper. Sorry, let me back up there for a second and just continue making that statement. So just 4 years ago, he included human-animal interactions, which would include training practices. And that's something that I make note of in the paper. So this is a rapid evolution of our ethics of thinking about how we treat animals under our care. even down to terminology that we're using. So even instead of referring to ourselves as owners, you're starting to hear terminology. And I have another paper about this as well, about using terms like guardian instead of owner. Talking about describing a life worth living for animals, the freedom to do these particular things, the freedom to have proper nutrition rather than freedom from starving. So things like that. And that includes our training practices. So that's why I think talking about ethics more, particularly the general ethics and some of the things that led to this, to our changing our training practices, where it coincides in particular, is really relevant. So that said, let me give you just a little bit more about history, because now, or a little bit more of the history of what we're talking about here. And I have a reference, a paper I published a few years ago talking about history of modern animal training, particularly as it relates to what happens in zoos. But it's really a synopsis of history of modern animal training that goes back to the Brelands and Skinner themselves. So a history of the use of positive reinforcement as a primary means to change animal behavior. So when we think about this history, we can think of two events that both happened in 1951, two really important events. Skinner's quote unquote discovery of shaping, his first use of the term shaping, happened in 1951 in his article, How to Teach Animals. And then we also saw in 1951, so Skinner published that in a magazine. And at the same time, Keller and Marion Breland published an article talking about a new field of applied animal psychology, also published in a magazine in 1951. So why did they both have this similar this paper describing similar use of positive reinforcement around the same time? Well, not that long before, less than a decade before, it ended in 1943, that both Keller and Marion Breland were working with B.F. Skinner on a project called Project Pigeon. Now, you can go and read some of the history of this from a few different places, including Skinner himself published an article about Project Pigeon, sometimes called Project Pelican. The Fernandez and Martin article details it a bit. Capshoe, this 93 article, has one of the best detailed descriptions of what happened during Project Pigeon. But to give you a brief synopsis, this was happening at University of Minnesota between 1941 and 43 is when it was implemented. Skinner came up with the idea in 1940, again during World War II. So we're seeing other events inspired by World War II. And at that time, people dropped bombs from planes and they landed wherever they landed based on where you dropped them out of the plane and all those other elemental forces. There were no rockets. There were no guided missiles. So Skinner had the idea that, I could train some animals to guide the fins on the back of these bombs so that they could be more accurate and pinpoint where they were going. And he happened to be on a train going back, I think coming back from a Chicago Association of American Psychological Association conference, so APA, from Chicago to Minneapolis, and saw pigeons out the window and thought, those are the animals that I could train to guide bombs. They have great vision. They fly. I'll be able to train them to peck a key, or peck this plate that they could use. And that's exactly what he did. He had eventually put three pigeons together in what was called the Pelican, hence why it was sometimes called Project Pelican, or the hull of the bomb. And they would peck on a screen together, each of them maneuvering a different fin of this bomb. And that's what would allow it to guide. And on that screen, so they basically had a little picture on their screen, and that was where they were aiming towards. So if as they would move, as they would peck towards that object, it would direct them closer or further away from that object. So they did that in tandem together. Pretty ingenious, and it worked. The military never ended up implementing the project because it wasn't too far after that you had the first atomic bombs. So not really much need for precision at that point. So, but nonetheless, it was pretty ingenious. They did this by 1943. By the time their military contract ran out, the Brelands were so impressed by this that they left academia altogether. They said, yeah, we're going to go start a training business. And that's exactly what they did in 1943. And Skinner went, all right, I'm going to keep doing my professor thing. And that's what he did. He eventually went over to Indiana for a couple years and then back to Harvard. And so by the summer of 48, he was back in Harvard. By the time he wrote this article, he was saying, I did some pretty neat stuff back there in Minnesota, and maybe I should talk a little more about it, because he was still in contact with the Brelands, who had now spent the past 7, 8 years training animals for a living and essentially implementing positive reinforcement as the first applied endeavor of the field of behavior analysis. So that was the first field that they started doing in 1943. Pretty impressive. Now, just to give you another little bit of history, and then we're going to move on from history. As much as if it's not obvious, I love to talk about this history. That is actually in that picture. That's a colorized photo. And that's Keller Breland there on the left and Marion Breland on the right. That is actually part of what was IQ Zoo, that they eventually moved down to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and ran this IQ Zoo that taught they trained animals. It was a roadside attraction. People came in and they learned about some of these principles about operant conditioning. And that very important participant in IQ Zoo there is actually Professor Punch. So that's him on the piano. I cannot attest to either how well he plays the piano or any of his academic credentials, but his name was Professor Punch. So now, one of the things I think that's most amazing about this, and one of the reasons I like talking about the history too, I don't think the Brelands get enough credit. Um, it's they really started it all, to as simply as I can state it. It's amazing what they were able to do. And one of the reasons why we see the popularity that where that started to emerge from is the fact that they were as transparent about what they were doing as possible. So they were doing this in the 1940s. It wasn't just whether if somebody walked up to them and asked them about what they were doing. It was they were they were yelling it at the top of their lungs, just about. They would put on these shows at IQ Zoo with Professor Punch, and they'd say, and by the way that we trained this animal was that we used positive reinforcement, which meant we delivered a positive reinforcer in the form of a treat as a consequence for this behavior, etc., etc. They described exactly what they were doing. They told everyone about it. By the mid 1950s, 1955, they started training marine mammals, particularly dolphins, at Marine Land in Florida, and they did the same thing. And they created the first dolphin shows as a result. And people just grabbed what they saw, what the Brelands were teaching them, and then ran with it. So this is how we saw that proliferation. That history means that so by 1955 they were training dolphins at marine land among other marine mammals. They were then training marine mammals for the Navy. The you saw that expansion of dolphin shows, including the emergence of places like SeaWorld in the 1960s. By the 1960s, this also some of these dolphin places opened up in Hawaii, where one of the people that was a dolphin trainer in Hawaii at a facility there happened to be Karen Pryor. So she was trained by people that were trained by people that were trained by the Brelands. She went on to write a couple books, one of those eventually being Don't Shoot the Dog in 1985. One of still, I think, one of the most important books that we've seen on talking about the use of positive reinforcement to change behavior. And when you read Don't Shoot the Dog, I think the most common misconception for somebody who doesn't read the book, I'm imagining everybody here has probably read at least part, if not all, of Don't Shoot the Dog. So you know this, but I always find this amusing when I point this out. They're like, oh, that's a book about dog training. And it has very little to do with dogs. Almost everything she's talking about in the book is about how to change human behavior. But she certainly keeps to the behavior analytic principle of just talking about behavior, changing behavior, regardless of whose behavior we're talking about. So pretty amazing stuff. From there, I'm going to move on from the history. This is my last little part. Oh, actually, I have one slide after this that I'll show you as well. So this is about that transparent description of positive reinforcement that the Brelands would give. So really pretty incredible what they were able to do. Now, this is a nice little blending of those histories, animal training and animal welfare. This is an illustration by Lily Chin that was done for the publication itself. Lily is a great friend, wonderful artist. She did an amazing job of creating some of the graphics for this publication. And she put up with me saying, wait, we have to put this here or that there, or all these different points that we had to. Oh, also, apparently I was 1 year off. Karen Pryor published Don't Shoot the Dog in 1984, not 1985. So just had to remind myself it's 84, not 85, since I like to give citations by the correct year as much as possible. But here's some of those different events that I've talked about. So, and this is in that publication. So, okay. So we're on to the second part, which is talking about Lima. And if you're not familiar with Lima, I mean, I'll just detail some of the specifics about it. Here's what the acronym stands for, which is least intrusive, minimally aversive. Lima was developed. Stephen Lindsay actually talked about it a little bit prior to 2005, but he didn't really detail it until his Handbook of Dog Training Methods, the 2005 one that he published. It was meant to describe the ethics of some training procedure based on whether it was intrusive or aversive. There's the modern emphasis, at least for some people, at least in some places, but again, we'll come back to that because that becomes one of the issues that I have concerns about in terms of the Lima model. The modern emphasis for some people has been on positive reinforcement. And there's three problems, again, me and my trilogies. So three problems we will consider here. A lack of clarity in its terminology. I think there's a lack of clarity in the acronym itself. Ambiguity in desired training approaches. And these also go from least to most concern for me. So I actually implemented my own little hierarchy in how I approach this. And then a history of justifying aversive training techniques. So I'll talk about each of those three issues that that I consider with Lima. The first, in terms of the terminology issues, well, a focal point for the Lima acronym and the Lima approach, as Lindsay described it, is its emphasis on the term intrusive. The issue is, what does this mean? And what I mean by that is, what effect does intrusive describe in terms of some impact on behavior, directly observable behavior? So intrusion tells us little about behavior or how behavior changes. If I say that was intrusive on that dog, I have no idea what effect that had on the dog's behavior. And while it's important to consider a variety of things, including the affect, the emotional response, the fact is that when we talk about an impact of some environmental procedure of something that we do or something happening in the environment on the behavior of an animal, on the behavior of any individual, we have to consider how we're able to accurately and directly describe it in an overt manner, in something that we can directly observe. So that's the critical part there. So at best, intrusion needs to be operationalized. I don't know what impact intrusion has on behavior. I don't know what that means. And what I like to point out is the ambiguity of that term intrusive. It's so ambiguous that it required the acronym tell you the same thing twice. Least intrusive, minimally aversive, right? So that's how much intrusive, that's how little, I guess I should say, intrusive means as a term, is that Lima had to spend its acronym saying the same thing twice. So that's a bit of a problem. But we'll come back to what's a potential solution. So what I'll leave off here saying is that that focus should be on an observable, measurable effect, something that we can see in terms of a behavior change. Okay, so our second point happens to be that procedural ambiguity, the application. What is Lima telling you to do? And the reality is, possibly because Lima had to spend so much time in its acronym saying the same thing twice, that it tells us very little about what you should do. So what Lima primarily focuses on is what not to do. It's saying be least intrusive, be minimally aversive, right? Be least or minimal. And that is still a subjective description itself, particularly when we involve terms like intrusive. But if we want to focus on being ethical in our training practices, particularly if we want to focus on the use of positive reinforcement, that means we should focus on things that we should do, on things we want to see happen. So that's what is our metric for success? What would we like to see? As I often say, I mean, I think most people working with dogs under any conditions, if you walk in, and this is really, I mean, the amount that I've used this in my daily life, whether I'm talking about human or animal behavior, or again, one of the reasons why I just talk about individuals, because I'm just thinking in terms of behavior. When someone tells me, oh, my students are doing this, I don't want my students doing this, I don't want my students doing that, or a dog trainer or a zookeeper is saying, oh, I need my animal to stop doing this, I need them to stop doing this, I wish they would do less of that. My immediate response is, what would you like them doing instead? So, and I think most of us have been trained to do that. That's critical for finding things to reinforce. That's what that means ultimately. So Lima doesn't really tell us about what procedures to use, just what we're supposed to not do. So applied behavioral principles and procedures have this long history, a more than half a century history. In fact, in the field of applied behavior analysis, Wynett and Winkler, so more than half a century ago, wrote an article about the fact that this was something that people were doing in the classroom. Behavior analysts were going into the classroom and working on doing things like keeping kids in their seats, so reducing the amount of time that kids were getting up, reducing the amount of time that kids were vocalizing, being disruptive. All these things, they were looking at reducing all kinds of behavior. And in the end, all they were producing were a bunch of kids that didn't behave. They sat in desks and didn't behave. And that's what so Wynett and Winkler set up what became the guiding set of principles for a guiding practice, I guess I should say, for all of applied behavior analysis, which is focus on what you want them to do, not what you want them to not do. So look for things to reinforce. And the final concern I have with Lima, what I consider the most severe, what is the certainly the most critical, I would say, about my concerns with Lima is this coercion acceptance. So uh I won't even say possibly. I know I'm saying this on the slide as possibly most problematic. It is the most problematic for what Lima has stood for, what it continues to stand for, depending on who you talk to, because there's enough ambiguity built into Lima that it can mean very different things for very different people. So, depending on who you talk to, Lima means very different things. But Stephen Lindsay was clear on how he intended Lima to be used. So we can go right to the source. And this is the first description of Lima on page 29 of his handbook here, where he says, and I'll go ahead and read all these out. According to the least intrusive and minimally aversive Lima model, this is the first time he's really describing. He had mentioned the Lima model in other places before, but this is the first time he's really describing what it is. So aversives are ranked in terms of their relative severity and intrusiveness, requiring that the trainer apply a less aversive technique before advancing to a more aversive one. So that is page 29. Uh, some people have debated that. They've said, well, but he's saying, right, he's just saying you can use these aversives, but first you do this, and he's just not ruling them out. Mind you, if you look on the page next to this statement, there's pictures of prong collars and choke collars and whatnot. So he's got a picture of a prong collar right there on page 30. And if you continue to read the handbook, you turn to the next page after that, page 31. He's got a couple other lovely quotes. In case you thought he was just showing you a picture of a prong collar and talking about how it's okay to use aversives like prong collars, but he wasn't actually advocating for them. Well, let's continue with some of his quotes. So, although some rather vitriolic and unproductive hyperbole bubbles up now and then again against the use of various training collars, most experienced and competent trainers agree that such tools have a functional and humane place in dog training. That's on the same page as the definition he gave for Lima, that he's saying, yeah, we have to use these tools. We have to use tools, and the tools he's talking about, prong collar on that next page. Well, here's on that page over, page 31 that I mentioned. The proper use of the prong collar as a shaping and polishing tool requires significant instruction, but with respect to basic control uses, novice trainers can rapidly master the prong collar. That sounds like a pretty strong statement of support for the use of prong collars, so that picture was not there for no reason. All these statements. And finally, you can, I mean, there's many quotes that you can find throughout the book where he is talking about the necessity of using aversive tools. This final statement, he says, aversive procedures are legitimate and valuable tools for controlling undesirable behavior. What's interesting in and of itself about that statement is I've seen people then go on to continue and say, oh, but read on to what he said. I think it's pretty clear that statement stands alone, along with the other statements. And it's interesting that people want to accuse, it's like, well, but you're cherry picking statements. These are all over the book. And if you have difficulty with any of these statements or the context of them, um, it's worth pointing out that Stephen Lindsay continues to argue in support of shock collars amongst other aversive tools. So he has and continues to be somebody who argues for the use of shock collars as a viable tool to train animals, to train dogs. So I don't think there should be any question about Stephen Lindsay's intent in what he had for describing Lima. Lima was created to help trainers select aversive training tools and techniques. And people, this has been a criticism that quote unquote balanced or what I would call traditional trainers have made against the reward based or force free or positive reinforcement based, whatever we might call it ourselves, the balanced or traditional trainers have made this argument for years that it's silly that there would be anyone that would use Lima to try to describe a reward-based approach to training methods, a reward-based only training approach to training methods, since it's very clear what Lindsay intended that to be. Now, all of that said, especially given there's been some interesting discussions in the past year plus um, about this and continuing to occur. So there's a couple things that I say about all of this, which is above and beyond all else, I really, really wish. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been on the internet, but apparently that's a place where people tend to get heated. So above and beyond all else, I really wish people could disagree a bit better. Um, Meaning that it's fine for us to disagree, that you can disagree and it's not a personal attack, nor does it need to become a personal attack. And beyond that, I am not an oracle. I don't know anybody else who is an oracle. I get things wrong all the time. There are lots of things I either don't know or get wrong. So that said, I can disagree with somebody else and not have to turn that into a personal attack, nor demand that their position is in some way inferior or less knowledgeable than mine. Um, it is a disagreement, and we need to disagree better. We need to get better at being able to disagree better. So, while I am not supporting the idea of unifying, or any of these other ideas where it's let's just get together and with balanced or traditional trainers and somehow meet in the middle. No, I know what my ethics are. I know what the science has said about the effects of these procedures on the welfare of animals, but I think it's fine for me to disagree with other people on that and not insult people in the process. So that's part of, and if there are people that want to continue to use Lima and say, but Lima means this to me, that's their choice. So I don't think there's any reason to attack people for their particular beliefs. Um, Other than to say, but I have this disagreement with you on what Lima is. And here is the information that I have on that. So, I always like putting that disclaimer there once I finish talking about all the problems I have with Lima, because boy, has it been an interesting past year plus. So that said, let's get to the third and final part. We'll talk a little bit about my proposed alternative, what I call the life model, least inhibitive, functionally effective model. And I know this is going to come as a surprise to the group, but I am proposing this as a three-part trilogy once again. So to move, what I would say is to progress beyond Lima and to give Lima that credit that Lima has got us to this point, regardless of whether it has these problems or not. We are to this point. We have to give Lima that credit that we've gotten to this point. And I think that's how progress always works. So I would like to progress beyond Lima at this point, and this is my proposed alternative. So the life framework proposes talking about an inhibitory rather than an intrusive effect. So an inhibitory effect on behaviors to be avoided. The second point being the importance in identifying function for behavior change procedures. So part of that ties into a focus on identifying what we would like to see done. And the third part is the use of effectiveness as a practical metric for training success. So all three of these points, again, and they really build upon each other. So it makes life as an ethics training model or approach or framework. I'm not picky about how you refer to life. If you call it a model or framework or approach, that's up to you. It allows us to emphasize the important interplay between training success and positive welfare. And that last part is a big component of why I opted to publish this as a peer-reviewed academic article, aside from the fact that I wanted this discussion to start emerging with an academic with academic support in an academic context. It's also that I wanted the training sciences, the science that we know about the ethics and practice of animal training, to start more directly connecting with the welfare sciences. So, and I think that's absolutely critical. So let's talk about each one of these parts. The first part itself. Historically, there have been two terms that have identified a procedural impact on behavior. One of those being restriction, things like the least restrictive alternative or the principle of least restrictiveness. These are what applied behavior analysts, applied behavioral scientists have used to talk about restricting behavior. What they have typically not used is the term intrusion. So intrusion has only been used in a few contexts. So they've tended to focus more on restriction or restrictive, being restrictive, and inhibition is the second term that behaviorists have tended to use. In fact, behaviorists and biologists alike, inhibition has 100+ year history of being used within classical conditioning or Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, terms like conditioned inhibition. Inhibitory stimuli as well, talked about within operant conditioning and other behavioral sciences. So inhibition, and then going back to even within the biological sciences, talking about inhibitory processes. So both terms are synonymous and emphasize a removal of choice, in this case with respect to behaviors, an inability to engage in a behavior and a removal of choice. So if we are talking about being least inhibitive, we're talking about offering as many choices, as allowing the animal to engage in as much behavior as possible, as is possible for that set of conditions. So we're not inhibiting behavior. We're not trying to reduce behavior. Our focus is not there, which leads to part of the second point in connection with function. So identifying function itself, that if we do want to focus on increasing the things that we see in using positive reinforcement as well, it means we have to get better at identifying the function of behavior. So the science of behavior has emphasized assessments to identify function. Since the 1980s, we've seen the applied behavioral sciences emphasize using data to guide function. That has included things like functional behavior assessments, as well as functional analyses. Those have been two critical means of using data to assess function. But at the end of the day, the important point here is in identifying the function of behavior. So behavioral assessments themselves are expected to connect directly to behavioral function, but ultimately the main goal is simply to identify the function of some behavior. Because as I like to point out, by knowing what causes behavior, it means we're more likely to change it and we're more likely to find things that we can reward. That ultimately, for me, I know if we think about what happens when people opt to use punishment, It's often, I need that thing to stop. I need that thing to go away. I don't care why it's occurring, just make it go away. So that's when we see people doing things like yelling, hitting, etc. And I'm talking about not people being trained by other people necessarily, but why people might use punishment. Um, Often because they are negatively reinforced. Their response of using punishment, I should say, is negatively reinforced in that if there's a dog barking around me and I yell at the dog and they stop barking, I've made the barking go away. And that will potentially increase the likelihood of me yelling in the presence of barking in the future. I don't need to know why the barking was occurring. I now know I can just yell to stop barking from happening. So this is how we've had thousands of years of training history that has been so heavily reliant on punishment and negative reinforcement, because there's no doubt to say, as I like to point out, punishment works. By definition, it works. And it is fairly intuitive. It makes things go away. You don't need to know why they occurred. The issue is if we're just focusing on changing behavior, we can start to question how long does that behavior change last? But beyond that, we can start, and as I get into the third point, we'll talk about this a bit more. We can talk about what happens to our relationship with that individual and to the welfare of that individual. And that to me is the crux of the argument against the use of relying on aversives, particularly contrived aversives to change behavior. So ultimately, when we start to identify the function of some behavior, it means we are more likely to change that behavior without having to rely on punishment because we know why it occurred, and that means we can change where the rewards occur. So if we have a dog that may be barking because occasionally, in some cases, especially when punishment goes wrong, which it often does, you might end up finding, and particularly if the animal is not receiving much attention for anything else, otherwise, they may start engaging in behaviors to get yelled at, to get some form of attention. Certainly, we see this particularly with children that are where they children and animals that exist in environments that are heavily reliant on a lot of aversives. It turns out they may start to work for any form of attention, since any form of attention is better than no intention. So if we understand the cause of some behavior, why that's occurring, it means we can change where those consequences occur. So in cases like that, we can deliver attention for behaviors we would like to see. In cases where an individual may be trying to escape or avoid some set of contingencies, we can change the how the consequences occur so that they are more likely to receive rewards or even a removal of some environment so that it's something that's functional for them. It's appropriate for them. It's something that's desirable to us. This is what ultimately, I mean, if we want to be effective at using positive reinforcement, we have to understand the function of the behavior and apply reinforcers for engaging in those behaviors as we see them being fit for what we would like to see. Okay, so the third final point, the life model places importance on our behavior change procedures being as successful as possible. So rather than simply identify what not to do, we focus on what we should do. Nonetheless, effectiveness itself is not our only metric. So if we only rely on whether something was effective or not, that can justify the use of punishment or other aversive procedures. So it has to be combined with function to be properly utilized. This is something that, again, applied behaviorists have been talking about for decades, for nearly half a century. So the latter part of the life model emphasizes not just being effective, but it identifies function, as we've already talked about, the importance of function, identifying the identification of cause, being effective, so the success, again, neither of these standing alone, but now we can incorporate them to say that we're being functionally effective. Our behavior plan, our behavior change plan understands and targets the problem. So we are using our understanding of the cause of some behavior to be able to effectively change that behavior. So that's the continuation of the point that I was previously making. And that's ultimately what it means to be functionally effective, that we understand the cause of the behavior and we're using our change of that behavior to help identify what it means and identify and set our criteria for the success of a procedure. Our success, our effectiveness is ultimately tied to the function of why the behavior is occurring. Okay, so to summarize, and then we'll have plenty of time to have some conversation and questions, and hopefully I have some answers. So Lima has been useful for identifying some core beliefs for force-free trainers. However, Lima's original intent and ambiguity continue to create an unclear message. So the life model provides a training framework that adheres more closely to the behavioral sciences, as well as connecting to the welfare and human-animal interaction sciences. So life trainers look to increase choice, understand behavior and its related causal contingencies, and maximize training success. And the life approach is a modern welfare and training philosophy to improve both human and animal lives. So I always think about this again in three parts. So we're talking about the change in behavior, the behavioral sciences, the change, how it matters for the well-being of the animal, the welfare of the animal, and then finally, what it means for the relationship we have with that animal. So that human-animal bond. Those are the three parts. The behavior, effect on behavior, the welfare of the animal, and our relationship with the animal. This is the last graphic I'll show you, and I already see there's some hands going up and there's some questions, so I'll get to those here in a second. I just thought I'd show the little graphic that really helps, I think, make this a little easier to translate, to think about, and how this might apply, what this means for welfare, what it means in application. Lily also made this wonderful graphic, including the life model graphic up above. And she didn't even have to ask me. She just put a penguin in the middle, right there, which I love penguins. So there's always a penguin somewhere on. So I'm surprised. I might not be wearing a penguin on any piece of my clothing right now, but normally I would be. And that said, here are some of the references. I'm happy to get this handout if there's not already a handout available. Also, all those references, all of these references, I think all of them are also included in the peer-reviewed publication. The peer-reviewed publication is open access. That's the link right there. We can type that into the chat. So if you just type it into Google Scholar, you'll probably pop up. I mean, if you type in Fernandez life model or Fernandez life training or something like that, you'll probably hit it pretty quickly. It's there. It's also on my ResearchGate profile. So yeah, that's all of that. And thank you. Those are some easy ways to contact me. Um, I'll leave that up for a second, and then I'll stop sharing, and we can go to questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That was fascinating and incredibly interesting. And I can see from our comments that that has been incredibly insightful for people. I'm just going to ask if anyone would like to ask any questions. I know we have run over slightly, but the recording will be available, so we will make sure everyone has that available as well if you do need to rush off. But does anyone have any questions for Eduardo, or any comments, any thoughts that they'd like to share?
I just saw in the chat too, I saw Ann McBride. Uh, I think she sent me a message, but that she's here, which that's great. We haven't seen each other in, I think, well over a decade. It was actually a ABA conference, so I don't know if Ann's still here, but if she is, hello. I still talk to Matt Parker very regularly, and actually, I was just to message her. Matt Parker is out there in the UK, another professor, welfare professor, and Matt and I talk all the time. And then Louis Bezo is here in the mainland of Australia, although out near, I think, in New South Wales. And I just saw him a couple years ago since I moved to Australia. So anyway, Anne, if you're here, we should catch up at some point.
That'd be lovely. Thank you. Great paper.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know there were some hands that went up before. I didn't know if there were any other comments, questions?
I am just looking through our chat box. Would anyone like to ask any questions? Has anyone got any question? There we go. We've got yes, comment that it feels very much as if the time has arrived to revisit our position on Lima, and I think that this has been incredibly insightful for us to be able to think about that, and particularly how we apply this in our work. So that's been really helpful, I think. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. Just looking.
Oh yeah, that's a really important point. I was asked about the infographics. Yeah, you can share any of this anywhere. If you're sharing the infographic, please give the reference, and Lily, more importantly, give Lily Chin credit for any of the infographics. I actually have all three of the graphics and I can send those out to you all as well, so that it's rather than just trying to like image capture from the paper or something like that. I have high quality images for all three of the graphics. The life model, so the life graphic itself, the last graphic that shows the three different with that life graphic on top, the three applications, what life means, and then the history, the welfare and training history, all three of those graphics. So
fantastic, thank you. That's excellent, and really valuable, I think, to have that. We'll have the life model being shared as well with everyone alongside the recordings as well, so that we can make sure that everyone has that information. I do see a question here from Nick asking whether you've discussed life with Dr. Susan Friedman, and if so, what her views were.
I haven't. So what I can tell you is that she is a big proponent of Lima, and I think not that long ago, she was making an argument again for Lima as a viable model to describe force-free training. And she also does push, I mean, she's one of the people that has pushed the idea of the least intrusive principle, which I think was it's not Alberto and Troutman, but it's not very well cited paper, I think, within the behavioral science. It's one of the really limited places where behavior analysts have applied behavior analysts have talked about intrusion rather than restriction or inhibition. So she certainly has, I would say, some of her own disagreements, and she's connected her own hierarchy to Lima, although I think that's potentially part of the disconnect there. But as I've pointed out, there is no, I mean, there's nothing that connects her hierarchy directly to Lima. I don't think she's, for any reason, particularly attached to the term intrusion. I think she would recognize that it's not a very good behavioral term. And and I've cited her within the life model itself. So I think I'd be happy to talk with her about it. I just haven't, and I think she's showing a bit of resistance, but that's understandable. You know,
Thank you.
change is not easy, right? So I would expect if she's read the paper, she will understand. She would certainly agree with the importance of function, and I would hope she would agree with being cited. So,
Thank you. And we've got a more specific dog training question as well for you, which is around sort of the results focus perhaps of people that we might be working with dog training. And have you had any problems explaining this to pet owners, or do you find that there's a certain way that this can be explained for them?
yeah, I think that's one of the points of the graphics, and I think that last graphic can help make it a little bit more clear. I don't really feel a strong, I mean, look, Lima, how much would you talk to a pet owner about Lima, right? How much would you say, hey, where do you stand on Lima? Right? I don't know that these models, I think, are meant to guide the researchers, the practitioners, um, and the applied researchers as well. And then those people working directly with dog owners, with dog guardians, with pet guardians at all levels. So, I don't know that I would be too stressed about. Usually, when I talk to um, pet guardians, if I'm talking to people directly about how to think about ethics, um, I keep it simple about, like, I talk about, what do you do. I talk about choice. That's one of the things I often talk about. I talk about the welfare of the animal. It's not that much different than the way that I talk about my own welfare research, that I say, look, at the end of the day, I've joked about with this with my students. My mom has described what I do for a living as, like, she says in her uh, loud Cuban accent, she says, I don't know, I think he makes penguins happy. And that's not a terrible description of the welfare sciences, which is making animals have a life worth living. That's why David Malloy described that. So making animals happy. I wouldn't use that in a publication, but at the end of the day, I think that's what all people, pet guardians, ultimately want, is they want to make their animals happy. And it's not hard to talk to them about, you know, maybe you don't have to force your animal to respect you to make everybody happy. Maybe that actually can create some of the problems or things like that. But I keep it pretty simple depending on, and I just read the room, because at the end of the day, I'm probably not having that conversation with someone at that level unless they're specifically asking me about what effect this might have or that. So, yeah,
Thank you.
I hope
That's
that
really,
makes sense.
yeah, it's really helpful for us to think about that communication. And we've got Jane, you've got your hand up, so I think we'll come to Jane and then we'll start to close questions. And so I'll hand to Jane.
Well, thanks very much again, Eduardo. It was great to hear the presentation, having spoken to you about this before. And apologies for raising this point again, because we did discuss it before. But
Yeah,
you focused a lot on dogs, but sometimes we do see that the equine community sometimes seems to present the view that aversives are more justified, in inverted commas.
sure.
Because horses are big and powerful and therefore are dangerous. And the same sort of sort of thinking applies, I think, in zoos with elephants, and also,
Yep.
I guess, with big animals like livestock, cows and so on. And I just wondered if you had any particular additional thoughts for us to bear in mind when countering those sort of arguments, that, you know, sometimes you have to do it because the animal's so much bigger and it's even more dangerous than a dog.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing still to me that somebody would think at some level that's a rational response to dealing with a big dangerous animal of any level is quick, hit it. It'll respect you. That's often the response you get, right? Do something like that. Because as people like Nate Azrin and other people who extensively study the use of aversives and punishment in the lab, as many other researchers, Murray Sidman being one of those, they would tell you aggression breeds aggression. And so you often see these problems that the result of using aversives, and the fact that we still have people advocating for using things like shock collars to deal with dog human or dog dog aggression is absolutely phenomenal. It's phenomenally bad, to be clear. It's pretty it's amazing to see that people are doing that. And there certainly is. This is part of why I often direct people, rather than go through the never-ending list of citations, of references, of people studying the effects of even directly shock collars on animals and the overwhelming amount of evidence about impact on training practices, on welfare, on relationship. I just say, you can just go to, and I can include a link here as well, to Zazie Todd has a wonderful list of resources, Dr. Zazie Todd, that she lists quite a number of these publications. I actually had a discussion not that long ago with somebody who had some extra references that were talking about some of these applications, but not in comparison. And that was the point that I made to them is, what is the impact on the welfare? Because we do know enough about this. So there's not that much that people are doing. And I think that's one of the things is talking about training methods. It's been pretty limited in the horse world. And so there's still such a heavy reliance on the use of aversives with horses. Probably the biggest reason is just because of that resistance, that history. You see that among different communities, that there's this idea that I still get that occasionally. I mean, it's been a while, I guess, since I've heard that. But even when I've given a presentation or I'm showing somebody something about some work that I've done or research that I've been involved with, or something that involves training an animal, and it's a large, dangerous animal or something that, I'll have that person that's like, oh, that's all great that you do that, but you can't do that with a horse because they won't respect you. And they'll say things like that, or you can't give a horse an apple. He'll just take advantage of you. And so there's still that mentality that you see so much of the time. Now, I think that there's a lot of wonderful people, and I'm part of a great Facebook group for clicker training horses, where you see a lot of people really pushing the boundaries of what can be done, um, of what's happening with the horse world, but it's a long way to go. I think. I don't have any great answers for um, how to help change that, other than it's just small steps. It's, gradual approximations, like any long-term shaping plan, I guess, that we work on these small steps. And I've certainly been invited and talked to a lot of horse people with respect to the life model. So there's certainly a lot of practitioners that are working with other people with their horses and and advocating for this. Um, there's research here and there. Paul McGreevy is one person, aside from the insane amount of publications he has in general, he has spent a long time looking at the effects of the bit on horses. And he has quite a number of publications out there. If you're not familiar with what a bit is this essentially a rod, a pole that goes into the mouth, and there might be multiple bits. People will even, this is part of the way that people respond to this, but it's this thing that allows you to put pressure on the tongue of the horse against the mouth. It is a modern day, not even that modern, but modern enough day torture device. It is insanely bad. And when you see even some of the physical effects on horses as a result of long-term bit use, some of these things that Paul McGreevy has shown, it's pretty bad. So I would say there's absolutely no reason for the use of a bit. It didn't take very much of Paul McGreevy's research to convince me how bad the bit was. So we're getting there. We just need more. We need better and more comparative research looking at training methods with horses, and more people making. So it's a slow process. Yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic. Really helpful there. I did say last question, but if we may, Eduardo, I do see one
Yeah.
more from Brian A.
Oh,
So
I have
if
plenty of time for questions. We can take more than just one more.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're aware of your evening time, but that's really appreciated.
Yeah.
So we've got a question here. Please could you outline why least inhibitory is not a scale similar to least invasive, both potentially encouraging use of tools gradually increasing an aversive effect on animals?
So why saying least inhibitory? If that was all the acronym said, then I would say there's no difference other than the use of the term and the fact that one is more is used more is directly applicable to behavior, right? Has been used within the biological and behavioral sciences, which is inhibition. So talking about being inhibitive is just more behaviorally friendly than being intrusive. But if my model was the least inhibitive model, it would essentially be the same thing as the least intrusive, minimally aversive model. But it's the latter part of the acronym. It's focusing on function and identifying what to do that makes for the difference. That's really the key component. So we still, I by no means do I want to say we shouldn't identify things that we don't want to occur. And also, and the fact that we should identify particular procedures or tools that we are saying, hey, maybe don't escalate towards this or that, or think about what an impact that has. I'm not saying you can't be hierarchical about it. And that's why even when you have approaches, for instance, like Friedman's hierarchical approach, I'm not saying that is that doesn't have its merit. That certainly does. There's nothing about the life model that's in conflict with that. But it can't be the only thing that we're using. We have to focus on identifying function and using function as part of our metric for success. So being functionally effective, that we are then identifying things that we want to try to increase. I hope that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. Thank you. It's more, my question is more about is exactly that, but it's about protecting the model and from interpretation rather than disagreeing in any way. I'm a really happy penguin. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also another thing that I like to point out too, which is, as I've jokingly said, like none of this, nor would I expect any of these models is like, Moses coming down off the mountain, saying, this is your one God now, right? There's not, I mean, if somebody wanted to say like, oh, I adhere to the life model and Susan Friedman's hierarchy and the Lima model and also this and that, like, okay. Um, there's nothing stopping somebody from saying or just saying like I do this and that and I take this from that and I do that. Again, for me, it's about, I would argue, well, I'm not sure that's the most parsimonious way to go about it, but so I'm thinking about what's appropriate, uh what's effective itself for the individual, what's the most um simplest yet still truthful, which I just operationally defined parsimony here, but the simplest yet most truthful way to approach something. And that's what I tried to put into the life model, but I have no allegiance to my own model, let alone expect anybody else to be like, yeah, let's all get rally behind this. So
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking our questions as well, Eduardo. That's really good of you. As we
yeah.
said, we will share this recording as well, and we'd just like to say a massive thank you for your time and for coming and speaking with us about the life model, and just to let everyone know that we will share that information. And I think we've all got a lot to think about, and it's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you once again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, this was great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, happy to answer anybody's questions even beyond this. So I think I don't remember where the slide was on this, but let's see if it I had there it is. There's my contacts. So yeah. So happy to talk to anybody afterwards. Just feel free to reach out.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sure we'll all think about additional things to talk through as well, following time to think about this. But that's been so insightful. Thank you so much. And we will let you go for your evening now, and enjoy your evening. But thank you everyone for joining us as well. It's been fantastic to have everyone here. Thanks ever so much.